Welcome to the Gilman-Woolsey podcast. This is episode number 13. Today I have Chris Vaccaro on with me. He is a data analyst. I'm actually been super excited about having this discussion today. Hi, Chris. How you doing?
Hey, how's it going, Gilman?
Pretty good. Can you tell us a little bit about what a data analyst is so people have an idea where you're coming from?
Well, data analysts can do any number of things. Data scientist, data analyst. It could be anything from managing SQL databases. It can be working with corporations, or it can be actually working in research. So it's a very broad term. A lot of what I do is I work with companies I've kind of become more of like a data consultant. So a lot of people don't know exactly, they don't know where to start. A lot of companies, they don't know what they can even do with data. They know that data will revolutionize their business. They heard it everywhere, but they don't know where to actually start. So when I work with companies, I try to show them what they can actually benefit. Like I'll go through their business model and we'll see what parts they can use data to better serve their customers. But a lot of what I do is in the research world, like academic research. I work with a number of professors, different universities to do scientific research. That's really, I have a passion for both. Like I love science and I love entrepreneurship.
So you're kind of taking the whole mess of data, boiling it down, and giving people answers to questions sometimes that they don't even know that they have, I'm assuming.
Exactly. I think that's really the benefit of data. Like to me, it's really a philosophy. It's very hard to get answers to questions using your own observations. Like humans just have, all these different cognitive biases that get in the way of getting real, true answers. And in the same way that it's very hard to shovel it with just your bare hands. You need tools. In the same way, we kind of need tools for the mind. So we really need to use data to get to the truth. Our mind just really isn't capable of it's really not capable of scientific truth. It's not evolved for it. And right. I think that data and data analytics is just a good way to get the scientific truth, just as science in general is. The randomized control trial is a tool to get to the truth. If we could just observe the world and understand what was going on, we wouldn't need that. But it doesn't appear to be that humans are that good at that.
Yeah, I heard something said once, and as I observe people, it definitely seems to be true. People make up their mind, and then they look for data to support the decision or the opinion that they've already made. Which, coming from the coronavirus, we're seeing this all the time as people are taking whatever position, and it's very hard for them to change positions at all. So,
and that's exactly true. That's decades of psychology has really, especially, I don't know if you know the work of Daniel Kahneman, but he has very much looked into that. People just come to the conclusion, then it's called confirmation bias.
Sure. Well,
they come to the conclusion first, then find the evidence.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with confirmation bias. I'm not familiar with that particular individual. But so the reason that I wanted to talk to you today is I wanted you to go through various data and trends that you're seeing as far as this particular pandemic, and what are your, I guess, predictions or analyses that you're coming up with based on the data patterns that you're seeing out there.
Well, there's so much to go through, and I'm sure it'll all come out as we discuss things. Right now, we were talking a little bit about Europe, and there's a couple of trends that are concerning. First, we obviously know about Italy. We all know about what's going on in Italy. It's a nightmare over there, a tragedy. My concern is I think that Spain might be. I don't think that Spain is going to be as bad, but I think it's going to be close.
So what is it
depending
about
on what action they take?
Well, what is it about Spain and Italy that have made them particularly bad compared to other countries over in Europe, in your opinion?
it's hard to say. The first hypothesis was like the elderly population in Italy, but Spain doesn't have the same elderly population, and there are other countries that also have elderly populations. Like Japan has about the same age group as Italy, but Japan is doing phenomenally with all this. Like th- that's a whole nother thing we probably should talk about. But Japan, all right. So in a lot of Europe, the amount of cases is doubling every 2 days or so, right?
Wow.
In Japan, they've got it down to every 10 days. So their exponential curve is much smaller than a lot of Europe.
Hmm. I didn't realize Europe was that fast. I mean, I've heard doubling times of anywhere from 4 to 5 days, but 2 days, that's really remarkable.
Okay, well, it's gotten better over time. When it first caught up, it was about every 2 days, right? But as time goes on and they've taken different measures, yes, you are right. The curve has kind of bent. And this is probably like one of the charts that we'll put in the video. The curves have bent. So at first it was doubling every 2 days. Now you're about right. It's every 3, 4, 5 days. It's kind of like a bent curve. It's not a linear.
Yeah. One of the things that I've found a little bit concerning is you don't have to just bend the curve, you have to completely flatten the curve. Because,
Yes,
as you know, a steep curve just means that the disease transmission is accelerating, or the number of people infected
slowly.
is accelerating. And as you flatten it, it's still, accelerating. It's just accelerating slower until you
Yeah,
get all the way to flat.
which is exactly what China and South Korea have done. And it's possible that Italy has done that. I mean, we've seen their new cases going down quite a bit. I mean, the last couple of days, it's hard to tell off a couple of days, but last 3 days or so, their new cases have gone down, down. So it is possible that we're seeing a trend there, similar to what we saw in South Korea and China.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is so hard about this illness is there's a couple of different lags that I'm seeing. The first lag is obviously recognizing how big the population infected is, and the second lag is the death rate. So initially, you're going to see this big spike of people before you even know they're infected, and then you have this big group of infected people, but a bunch of them haven't died yet, and all of a sudden the disease catches up to people. It seems from what I'm seeing about 3 weeks, all of a sudden people
Yeah.
start tipping over, having problems, and you see this spike in the death rate, even though, say, you may have flattened the curve already, the infections aren't increasing, but the deaths go through the roof.
Yeah, then you also have the lockdown leg. You have the time they may implement the lockdown this week, but the death rate and the new cases rate might still be going up, even though nobody's communicating with each other. Nobody's even going, like, social distancing is. There may not be anybody even getting newly infected, but we're still discovering that they're infected because it takes between 1 and 10 days for symptoms to even start appearing.
Yeah.
So there's that lag as well.
Yeah, something I'm curious to get your opinion on, because I've actually been quite critical of the plan that the United States has come up with, 15 days to slow the spread, because it's very unevenly applied throughout the country. Certainly there's different demographics, population densities and stuff out there, but it's hard, looking at the data, because we see this big spike, but like you say, there's a couple week lag in seeing any response to begin with. From what you're seeing around the world, does it appear that the measures that they have taken in that 15 days to slow the spread campaign should be effective, and we should expect to see the curve starting to flatten down?
Well, what you're saying is exactly right. This 15 days it's too simple. Every city has different needs. Every town has different needs. New York City is going to have very much different needs than a town in Kansas. And they're also locking down some like very suburban towns as Kansas that has 1 or 2 cases, and the same way that there may be locking down New York City. I think it's a gross oversimplification to say 15 days to stop the spread. It's much more complicated than that. Every area has to be treated differently.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, somewhere in Kansas, for instance, it may make a lot of sense to do aggressive testing, contact tracing, quarantine of just specific individuals versus in a large city like New York, where there's a big population, there's centralized transit and whatnot. You may have to lock down the entire population because there's just no way otherwise to get control of it again once it's broken out past a certain point.
And I think that New York City, now that we're talking about New York City, I think they're doing a very good job of just isolating themselves. Like they haven't really, very recently, they brought in police and all that, and they've been actually cracking down like that. But from what I've seen, it just seems that people are taking action and choosing to stay home because they are concerned about their city. Like if I was talking with friends and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna all go out," like people jump on them, like, "Don't even joke like that." Don't you're not going out. Like it's people don't want to go out. They know the risks of it, and while there is they're just starting to bring a police presence in. I don't think it's like an authoritarian thing. It's really everybody agrees that this is best, and that is one thing I will say that I'm very proud of New York City for.
Yeah, and that's totally different than it is in Arizona. I mean, just on Monday, Jackie was going to work and some of her coworkers were kind of, joking around. They're like, "Oh, this is a problem in New York City. We're not going to have this
Yeah, no,
problem here. There's lots of sunshine and other things that are going to change it." And both of us were
yeah, no,
like, "Look at the patterns, At first, it started in Europe and China. It came over to JFK and these big gateway airports because that's where everyone comes into. But
yeah,
what's happening between us and New York? Have they cut off flights between New York? Like people are coming into our airport, hundreds of flights a
yeah.
day from New York. Of course, it's going to spread. It's just a matter of time, and you're seeing that even in the trend lines of Phoenix. We're just at an earlier phase than they are.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's unfortunate that it would be really nice that if people just took action before things got too late, while we still have that window of opportunity. But unfortunately, maybe some places it just has to get bad enough for people to see it themselves. I wish it were another way, but
But it's been that way everywhere. I mean, if we look over in Europe, in Italy, for instance, they put measures in place. People didn't observe them. The government did more strict measures, and it really took the point where the whole populace got on board, and they actually were pushing the government to become more strict. And so there's a big social proof
hmm
element with all of this to effectively quarantine people. You have to have a big buy-in to the population that they're almost
yeah.
shaming people, like you're saying in New York right now. They're almost shaming people to not get on board and to not go along with it.
Yeah, it's a very much a bottom up situation. Like the populace decides that this is what's best, and from that zeitgeist, that the common belief, then that rises up to the government. So the people start demanding that the government takes stricter action. It's not the government. It's not a top down approach. It's not the government forcing this on people. It's the people forcing this on the government, and then the government implementing that.
Yeah. Last night, when we were kind of preparing for this, you were showing me some maps of the hotspots in the United States, and you were saying that the distribution all over the world has been very similar, and so we should kind of be aware of this and be expecting this even here in the United States. Can you explain that a little bit?
Where are you talking about the cities? How it's spreading out from the cities?
Exactly. That basically it seems to be related to population density. That high
Yeah,
population density areas are where it starts, and then it kind of filters out from there.
yeah. It's almost like it's almost like if you would think of like a disease itself, like a disease in the human body, and something gets infected and just it starts growing out from there. It's almost exactly like that. You get the most densely populated spots like Manhattan, and then it starts trickling into places like Westchester and Long Island. So what you see is the heart of New York City, like Midtown Manhattan, the rest of Manhattan is a black area, right? Is how they color coded it on some of those things. So let's say black, red, orange, yellow. So what you'll see is the most densely populated part of Manhattan is a black area, but then the lesser, like some of the boroughs, are just a dark red area. So like Brooklyn, the Bronx, they're just a dark red area. But then as you start moving out, and you have like Long Island, for example, you have the parts of Long Island that are closer to New York City, they're a red area. Then when you start getting to the tip of Long Island, it's a little less and less. So the closer you are to the heart of the city, it seems like the worse it is. And that trend continues. That's not just New York City. That's Phoenix, like you said. It's Chicago. It's Detroit. It's Los Angeles. It's all of these cities. It's not just New York. And what's concerning to me is I also showed you the newest Gallup poll, and it showed who is taking this seriously, like who is actually avoiding social contact. And we saw that New England was avoiding social contact. Los Angeles was avoiding social contact. And it's like almost as you get closer to the center of the city, of the country, people are taking it less and less seriously. So when you get to like Texas, they're not really taking that much precaution, but those cities are being affected almost as much as Chicago and those other cities. And that's another thing that's concerning to me, because it doesn't seem like there's that much correlation between how affected a place is and how seriously. There is some correlation, but not enough in my opinion.
One thing that and this may just be totally unrelated, but when I was looking at that map, it almost seemed to me that bigger states had less concern. And I was wondering if it's because they have a few big cities where there's a big pocket, but there's so much additional space and people in that particular state that it's hard to kind of get everyone on board because they're all seeing such a different picture. I don't know if you noticed that or not.
I do think that is part of it. I think that the people in the rural areas are not taking it as seriously because they're not as affected. And another interesting thing, I think we discussed the rural-urban divide between Democrats and Republicans. Basically, the more densely populated a place is, the higher tendency they are to be politically liberal. And when you have people in the country that don't have a high population density, they are more likely to be conservative. So what you have is basically right now a disease that is disproportionately affecting liberals. So there is also this political aspect, and there's been a lot of polarization over the last few years, but now you have liberals who might be taking this very seriously because it's right in their backyard, and people that might be like in the country in a less densely populated area that aren't taking it as seriously. And it almost seems like another ideological gap, but it isn't. It's just that people who are on the left are being disproportionately affected by this. They're actually getting sick when the Republicans are not getting as sick.
Yeah, well, and certainly the messaging early on from Republican, the president, all the way down to the senators and members of the House, it kind of, and they've kind of walked it back a fair amount now. But I think that there's a lot of people at some level that don't trust what's going on because they think that there's some element of hysteria or some element of a hoax to it. And even Ron Paul recently came out and he had this video where he was detailing why all of this was a hoax to take control of the American people, etc. But his son,
I saw that too.
Yeah, did you see that his son actually was diagnosed with coronavirus though?
Oh, it's so sad, but it's like, yeah.
Well,
it's sad, but
I'm curious to see how his perspective changes based on his own son's illness, because and I think fundamentally it's going to come down to this. It has to hit close enough to home, whatever that is for each person, for people to take it seriously. And I think for a lot of people, they have their aha moment where they're like, no, this is real. For mine, I know exactly when it happened. It was on February 24th. I was at work and I was looking through news articles and I saw it was a picture from Lombardy and it showed grocery store shelves that were just emptied out. And like literally in that moment, it just like the light bulb turned on. I was like, this is, I always knew it was real. I guess I thought that we were going to be able to contain it like SARS and MERS. And when I saw
We've always been able to.
Yeah, we've always been able to. And so it's kind of that, normalcy bias where you think things will be normal like they were in the past. I mean, there's so many forms of bias, but in that moment, I was like, this is going to hit us and it's going to hit the rest of the world. The question is when. And that's
Yeah.
when I started to take it seriously. So
I think the moment for me was I was looking at some of the data on it, and I saw the beginning. I recognized it right away, a beginning of an exponential curve, and that was kind of my, excuse my French, my oh shit moment. I don't know if it's okay to curse on this show. We could bleep it out if we need to, but that was my moment where it was like, all right, this is a problem, because exponential curves are no joke when it comes to illness.
right. Right. Well, and that's the thing about an exponential curve is that it's a sign that the cat's out of the bag, because once it goes from linear to exponential, I mean, it's basically a mushroom cloud, and what you think is a big mushroom, like right now, if you look at the data in the United States, we think we have a sizable mushroom cloud. We haven't even seen the base of it if we don't somehow get control of this.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, it's also exponential. There's a difference between 2 and 4 people. There's a difference between 4 and 8 people. But when you start moving up that curve, the difference between 500 and 1,000 people, the difference between 10,000 people and 20,000 people, they become much, much bigger differences, and that's where we're at.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Right now, we're looking at daily increases of 10,000. If we don't somehow contain this, you're going to be looking at daily increases of 50,000, 100,000, even 200,000. So, it really, I mean, that's what the urgency to deal with this when it's relatively small, because it's easier to deal with it when it's small. But, at some point in time, it'll get far enough out of the bag that it almost becomes impossible to deal with it, at all.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the thing that another worrying moment to me when this was all starting was there was a Harvard epidemiologist studies the spread of disease, as you know, but just for the audience, Harvard epidemiologist basically saying if we don't contain this will infect 50 to 70% of the global population. Actually, wait, it was 50 there was a difference between the United States population. Let's just say about 70% of the United States population will ignore because we don't know exactly what's going to go on in Africa and all that. But 70% of the United States population, that's enormous. And people, maybe most people will get through this and will only have a death rate of maybe 3%. I don't think that's realistic. I think it's going to be higher than that. But 3% of 70% is almost 2% of the entire population. That's millions of people.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, if the population was, last I looked, it was 331 million people. So you're looking at almost 6.5 million deaths, if my, back of the napkin math is correct. I mean, that's
Holocaust numbers in the United States alone.
Right. Yeah, and it always amazes me when people say stuff like they're like, it's only 1%, it's only 1%. I'm like, even 1%'s a lot, but it's very foolish at this point in time to assume that it's only going to be 1%. In fact, you were mentioning to me something about what we call the case fatality rate or death rate from this disease. Can you explain what your concerns were there?
Well, every country has a different case fatality rate. We're talking about 1%. Italy has a case fatality rate of 10%. Spain is up to 7%. And the case fatality rate goes up as hospitals get more overloaded. So at first, Spain's case fatality rate was about 2%. But as time is going on, it's moved up to 7%. So that's when people are saying flatten the curve, that's what I said in the beginning. When the CDC is recommending these things, flatten the curve, this is good advice. This is very good advice, because the more a doctor's attention is pulled over several patients, the less care he could give to that. That's aside from respirators and all that, and the equipment and the other stuff in the hospital that has diverted patients, and if the case fatality rate goes up. I mean, Italy was looking originally, their case fatality rate was like 3% or something. Now it's at 10%. 10% of people who get this are dying.
Right. Well, and
That's a lot.
this is one of the things everyone, well, not everyone. Yeah, I'm friends with a lot of business owners. My brother owns a small business and a bunch of other people. And no one particular person has said this to me, but in various ways I've heard it expressed, we should just let it rip through the population, rip the Band-Aid off, get it over with. And the point I keep trying to make to him is I'm like, the degree of pain that you're willing to tolerate in the loss of human life is directly related to how quickly you're willing to let it spread through the population, because available hospital resources and available medical personnel and supplies, at least what I'm seeing in Italy, just looking at it. I mean, I'm not looking at the data specifically. I'm just looking at what's happening in Italy. I'm like, if we run out of supplies, if we run out of clinicians, if we run out of ventilators, what happens is the death rate isn't these rosier lower numbers around 1 or 2%. That's where we see the spikes, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. And 10% of, 200 million people is 20 million people. I mean, that's a lot of people. And, people say, well, is it really worth the economy, to do that? And my answer would be, yeah, probably. I mean, that's like wartime death tolls. Sometimes,
Yeah.
We take a big hit in America before we can start moving forward again. And I don't want to. But, at the same time, I also don't want to lose 20 million people.
Yeah.
And, tell me this, because I was doing some math today, and I don't know if the way I was doing it was correctly. So I was looking and I was saying, okay, if you had a family that had one 50-year-old person, a 40-year-old person, and 2 teenage kids, and they say that the death rate of someone over 50, I think it was 1.4, and someone in their 40s is 0.4, and then each of the kids was 0.2, that the risk of losing at least one person in your family would be 2.1%. In other words, you would add up the probabilities of each individual person, in the family, and that would give you the risk of losing at least one person in that particular family. Would that be valid?
Well, it would also depend on what the case fatality rate in the country at that time is. But
sure,
probability of losing, yeah, I mean, you would
So what I was using
I'd have to think.
I was using that study from the CDC in China, which obviously the data that we have may turn out to be different than that. But when I kind of added those together, it kind of was a shocking thing. So it was like if you had a family that was a 50-year-old, a 40-year-old parent, and then 2 teenage kids, literally 1 in 50 families like that, if they all got infected, 1 in 50 families would lose one of their family members. And
that's disturbing. I'd probably have to look exactly at the math and do it out, but it's dependent on so many factors. It's like different areas have different rates, but yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that from what I understand.
So, because in Italy, say that you just had a general population-wide death rate of 10%, and you had a family of 4 people, I would expect that you would have, and say you had 100% infection rate in the entire population. Everyone in the population got infected.
Yeah.
Every family of 4 would have a 40% chance of losing at least one member in their family in that scenario. So, and the way that I tabulated that is,
I probably have to think about that. You could be right. I would have to think about. I'm not that good at math in my head.
Yeah, well, get back to me on that, because it's. Well, when I viewed it that way, I'm like,
disturbing thought for sure.
Yeah, like there's a lot of families out there that don't think they're going to be impacted, but if that math actually holds true, which I'm pretty sure it does, when you start getting into larger and larger families, like I come from a family of 8 kids, so there's between the kids and spouses that's 16 plus my parents that's 18, and then we have like an additional 25 grandkids. When I added up all the probabilities, it was like 20% or 25% chance of losing one of those people in the family. And I was like, that's pretty astounding, and that's assuming, of course, everyone got infected, but
that's Russian roulette numbers. It's greater. It's worse than Russian roulette numbers.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing is when we're saying let it rip, well, how steep do you want that to be? Do you want it to be that two people in your family, tree of 40 people are going to lose their lives? Do you want it to be?
Oh, all right. So I kind of get what you're saying a little bit better now. So basically, in the case of let it rip, that's what that math would that's what the math would be.
Right, right. If you knew
Okay.
the
Yeah, yeah,
case,
no.
yeah. So if you knew the case fatality rate, if you knew the death rate of
Yeah.
people by age, you should just be able to add up the death rate for each person at whatever age it is, and you would come up with a total probability of losing one person within that group of people. So say a family of four is one group, the individual probabilities of them losing their life if they were infected should be additive, and you should be able to determine that.
If there were a way to just specifically protect, if we were able to protect just those who are at risk and let it rip through everybody else, then it might be viable, but it's impossible to protect people like that, because the more people that are infected, the more chance of the people who are at risk getting infected is.
Right, right. And the other thing too that I'm really concerned about is the reports that we're seeing coming out of places like New York. It's not 100% clear that this is as isolated to older people as we think. I heard today a
Yeah.
statistic. They said 40% of people between the ages of 18 and 50, or sorry, of the people that are showing up needing hospitalization, 40% of them are between the ages of 18 and 55. That's a massive population of not that old of people.
Yeah. And that's hospitalization. That's not necessarily death, but like we were talking about, when you start overloading the hospitals, does the person that is 30 years old who would normally not die, are they more at risk of death because the hospitals are so overloaded?
Right. Well, because when it comes to the hospital, it's a matter of utilization. So it doesn't matter if the person's 18 or if the person's 65, they're utilizing one unit of resource, whether it be
Exactly.
a ventilator or the number of masks or whatnot. And you're seeing in a lot of different places now that they're starting to really ration stuff. I mean, even here in Arizona and in Nevada, they're telling people at the end of your shift, throw your mask into this bag. We're going to, re-sterilize it and reissue
Oh,
it to people. And we're not even like at the tip of the iceberg yet as far as these
yeah.
places are concerned. So,
Well, another interesting thing, I don't know if you saw this, but Ford, a number of automobile manufacturers are rushing. They actually took some of their existing designs and they're rushing to make ventilators out of them, and they have had some pretty good success with it. I think that Ford now has a ventilator that is made from existing F-150 parts.
no, I haven't seen that. That would actually be really interesting. How
Yeah.
so? Because one of the big things that Jackie and I have been talking about is, it's great that manufacturers are going to ramp up production, but the problem is you have to retool everything, and retooling just takes time. If we could do it with existing parts and maybe create some jigs or something like that and manually assemble them, we might be able to, turn stuff out extremely quickly, which may change the dynamic of this disease to a significant degree.
This is from USA Today. Ford to make respirators, ventilators, and if you go into it, basically what they've done is they've taken existing F-150 parts and they've repurposed them so it's the same assembly line, same everything, but they've just been able to make ventilators out of it, which I find to be mind blowing. I think that's amazing if that all works out.
Right. Well, and if that's the case, then you would expect that General Motors and Tesla and all these other places,
Yes.
they would probably, once kind of that design is understood, we should be able to, share that with other people and have them also produce, stuff as well. Well, one of the other,
I think that will be the case.
yeah, one of the other
I've
things.
been really impressed with the private sector. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there was I also saw that they're trying to figure out ways to hook two people up to one ventilator. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but, it may be that, they can come up with a relatively, inexpensive device that can do that. And that would instantly double our capacity, in the US here. So.
Yeah, that's out of my knowledge jurisdiction. You would probably be in a better position to say. So I would trust your judgment on that. I don't know much about that type of stuff, but I do know that I'm really impressed with the private sector on this. Like, you have all these different companies doing their part. You have Amazon prioritizing necessity needs. necessity items over the regular purchases. Yeah, it's unfortunate that Prime on regular items takes up to 30 days, is what I read last report on some items. But at least they're prioritizing, the things that people need, especially in a time that people can't go out. I think just the private sector, and you also have Apple. They donated something like 9 million face masks. You had the founder of Alibaba, Jack. I'm at a loss of what
Jack
his last.
Ma.
Yeah, Jack Ma. He had what was it? How many ventilators?
Yeah, you know what I read is that I thought he donated 1 million tests and 500,000 face masks.
Oh yes, 500,000 face masks and 1 million tests. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, one of it's situations like this are so terrible, but in some regard, the country needs things at different moments in time to bring people back together and reunify people. I mean, except for, right at Washington, kind of the bitterness that is there between the two political parties, overall, it seems that, people are acting, more looking out for their neighbor. There's less animosity and stuff. Obviously, if we break down and it gets really bad and people panic, a lot of that will fall away. But at least in the short term, I do see kind of more coming together, industry trying to find a solution to the problem, people, donating stuff that they have in their own personal stashes to the hospitals because they know that those employees, need those supplies to actually be able to protect themselves so they can care for them. And
yeah, because the more hospital workers get sick, they're out of work. It's a bad situation.
Yeah, well, and they're, the risk that, and I know the CDC keeps saying, masks are not effective for the general population. And I wish they would say it a little bit different. I really wish they would say masks alone are not effective, because it is true that a mask will prevent you from breathing something in, but you need the entire...
Or touching your face.
But you need the entire spacesuit, that we use in the hospitals, because we take that and we throw it away, or now we're recycling it. But that's why a mask works in the hospital, is because we protect the rest of our bodies in addition to our mouth.
Yeah, and then you throw everything out, and everything goes in the garbage. Anything that may have had germs on it,
exactly,
is gone.
Exactly. Well, I want to get back to the data for just a second here. So we were...
I was thinking the same thing.
We were talking about death rate trends that you were seeing. Do you think that well, you had said that the death rates in Italy, Spain, and over in Europe have actually been increasing over time, versus the ones in Asia have remained relatively constant and relatively flat. What do you attribute to those differences between those populations?
Well, actually, I would have to look up. How flat the death rates in China actually are. I would have to look that up exactly. But my instinct would tell me that it probably did spike in the same way, but then went down after they started getting control of the situation better.
Well, why don't we exclude China for this particular discussion? Let's just talk about Japan, South Korea, and Singapore.
All right, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. Those are very interesting cases, because they've taken some interesting. Now we have to separate like what is government action and what could be other things. Like, there may be something about Japan that was not government intervention. Maybe, Japanese people are very to themselves. Maybe that's part of it. They're not as handshaky as people in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, one other thing
so it could be.
One other thing Jackie and I were wondering too is, we've traveled extensively. I think I've been in like 30 or 35 countries. But in Asia, all of these Asian countries we go to, people, wear very extensive face masks. And like you said, like hygiene is it's at a different level there than you really see in a lot of other places around the world.
Yeah, and that could be contributing to it. But for the sake of argument, let's look at what the government interventions are there, which were really interesting. So Singapore actually came, and we don't know if this will actually work in the West, but they came up with this system of kind of marking people who have the illness. Now, Singapore is it's very it's more definitely much more Western than China. Like they have a very good per capita income. It's close to the United States. They're not under communist rule. Um, it, it's closer to the culture of the United States than obviously China or North Korea, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what they started doing is they take the people that were infected and they kind of put them in like a database, and they mark like the places that they work, where they go to school and stuff like that. So it was almost like the system that we have in the United States for marking sex offenders. Now, that's why I say that I don't know that a system like that would work in the United States, because I just don't think that the people of the United States would go for it.
Well,
Marking people who are ill and tracking them and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big problems is we have what's called HIPAA, which I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. But HIPAA is basically the Patient Privacy Act, and I mean, there's unless they fundamentally change the law, at least right now legally, I don't see any way that they could do that in the United States.
Or if it was on an opt-in basis, if people actually did it voluntarily, which is a possibility at this point. Like we have seen communities doing things. We have seen people in communities doing things for their community that you would not normally see. Like I said, I'm very proud of New York City, but also, Los Angeles and the other big cities in the United States. If you look at drone footage from a lot of those cities, they are empty. Times Square is empty. A lot of Los Angeles is empty. New York City is usually hustle and bustle, but nobody's going out. And that's all out of respect for their community. So perhaps there is a possibility that people would voluntarily, on an opt-in basis, choose to say, yes, I am sick. These are the places that I go, and actually voluntarily track their illness.
Well, what did Singapore do as far, I mean, besides just identifying and marking people, what did Singapore do, I guess, to quarantine them? Did they physically quarantine them, or was it kind of like an honor system quarantine like a lot of places?
That I honestly don't know. We could look it up, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do know is in some cultures they take things much more seriously, and there's definitely a sense of social responsibility that doesn't always exist in Western or European countries. Although I kind of wonder if this isn't going to change that a lot. I mean, the fact that New York is empty, but it's imposed, but not to the most militaristic ways, but people are still observing it. It makes me kind of wonder if you're going to see a little bit of shift in attitude to everyone looking out for the good of the whole, if you will.
Oh, I'm hoping that's the case. Yeah. That's what I'm noticing that more in the East and West Coast. Like I said, as you get close to the center of the United States, it seems that they're not taking the measures as seriously, even if there is a big city nearby. And that's just based off the Gallup data, and the Gallup data only breaks it down by state. So it would be a lot better if they were able to break it down by either county or by jurisdiction somehow. Breaking it down by state isn't always the best way to do it. I would really love to see that data zoomed in and see if cities are taking it more seriously than rural areas.
So the other Asian countries, because this has been my analysis, and you tell me if the data supports this or not. It seems that the countries that have done well have kind of a three-prong approach. They do very extensive testing. They do a lot of contact tracing, and then they do a lot of isolation. That's what it is. And anywhere that's done that has had really good success, and the places that have had a more happenstance and kind of will control the disease as it comes out, those are the places that seem to have done poorly.
Well, actually, like you said, South Korea has done more tests than any other country. They've done the most tests out of everyone. Now, if you look at it on a per capita basis, they're still pretty high, but actually per capita, the most amount of tests, believe it or not, was the UAE. Mm-hmm. I think, and my theory behind that is because of the MERS outbreak. So I think that's kind of just part of their in their collective memory.
Yeah. Well, I think all of Asia, actually. I think Singapore, I think South Korea, and I think Taiwan, because South Korea had a big MERS outbreak. Both Taiwan and Singapore had a SARS outbreak. And from what
Yeah.
I've been reading, it was really the systems put in place and the procedures that were developed during that. It was kind of almost like the practice game for the big one. And when this came along, they knew exactly what to do, exactly the systems that they needed. And they moved immediately to put them in place, from the very first cases.
I think that is true, but I think also at the same time, the United States very recently had an Ebola outbreak, so we should really have this. We should really have this down pat too. And not to get political, but the CDC was just defunded 2 years ago, back in 2018. Not defunded completely, obviously, but they did lose a lot of funding. And one of the things to go was basically their infectious disease department. And I think that I I think that's just a calamity. I think that we're going to look back at that and we're going to be like, we wish we did that differently. We really wish we did that differently.
Yeah, yeah, for certain.
Because our Ebola outbreak was pretty much under control.
Yeah, how many? I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say it was less than a dozen Ebola cases, though, wasn't it? We didn't have. I mean, it was here, but I mean, we pretty much contained it from the very beginning.
It was a small amount of cases. I don't know the exact amount of cases, but we did a very good job of containing it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've been a little bit critical of how we handled it was in the very beginning, they were saying that they were containing it, but it was obvious that there were so many holes, in the dam that it was just a matter of time before they came through. And I think that in and of itself contributed significantly to the big spikes that we've seen because, whereas once it's worldwide though, I honestly don't know how entirely to contain it. I mean, your only real option is to cut off all flights, shut the borders down because a disease like this that has a slow fuse, people moving back and forth are going to carry it with them, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. So I'm sure that we're going to learn a ton of very valuable lessons from this particular outbreak, and hopefully we can create new policies, procedures, and ways of more proactively dealing with stuff because it's going to happen again. I mean, it happened in 1918, it happened in 1830. It seems like we're on a 100-year cycle, but now the world is more connected. You would expect it to actually happen more often.
Yeah, and hopefully we can start getting artificial intelligence. We can start utilizing artificial intelligence and machine learning to kind of predict these outbreaks.
Right. Well, and over in Israel, they have been using cell phones to do basically automated contact tracing. Once they identify someone that was infected, they actually go through all the metadata and they find all the people that this person was in close proximity with ever, and they basically send a notification to all of them. And
well, that's another thing that it's like good luck getting people to do that in the United States.
Right. Well, and the big question is whether there was a way to do it where it wasn't individually identifiable.
Traceable, yeah.
If it wasn't traceable, if you couldn't say, okay, I want to know where Bob Jones was yesterday, let's go to this system that we created to help control, this disease outbreak. But that's always the concern because the government is not honest. They just aren't. And they
use these little things. They say, it starts off as for our protection. That's exactly what happened with the NSA. It was first to track terrorists, but then after a little while, they just started tracking every single message that you've ever sent to anybody, and they just went completely out of control with it.
Right, and I think that's everyone's concern with any sort of system that can know. Well, I mean, the cell phone companies already know where everyone is all the time. I mean, basically, your cell phone is a beacon that is always transmitting. The question is someone putting all that data together into one place and being able to query the system or put something in and then push stuff out to a bunch of additional people. I mean, that's the piece.
Exactly.
That, is kind of scary.
Exactly. Because as of now, they need warrants for all that. But in times of crisis, these protections have a way of kind of loosening and, in some cases disappearing.
Yeah. Yeah, for certain. So, well, Chris,
which is something I think we have to be conscious of.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say, or?
No, that's pretty much it. The only thing I wanted to note is, like I said, I think that Spain is going to be the country to watch. I think it's interesting because most of the European countries, for the most part, have similar populations. They're around 60,000 people, some 80, some 40, but they're about the same. And each one of them are very different. And Italy and Spain, Italy is going to, I think when everything's said and done, Italy is going to be the worst, but I think Spain is going to be a close second. I'm hoping the best for New York City. Case fatality rate in Italy is, like I said, about 10%. As of now, the case fatality rate of New York City is about 1%, which is hopefully promising. But like I said, once the hospitals start getting overwhelmed, things do change. And I'm just hoping that we nipped it in the butt. I hope that we learned what happened in Italy and the people of New York City took precautions before it's too late, and time will tell if that is the case.
For certain. Well, it might be interesting in, say, 30 days or so to have you come back and we'll kind of discuss where things actually ended up going and get an idea of, how things are. I mean, maybe even earlier, maybe 2 weeks. I mean, a normal time doesn't seem to exist anymore. I mean, a week is a totally different universe at this point in time. So,
yeah, I'm sure we'll be in contact so we could, play it by ear and see where things are going. And once we think that something enough interesting things to talk about, then we could, maybe do it again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to be on. Thank you for having me on.
All right, good night. Thank you for listening to the Gilman-Woolsey podcast. We hope you enjoyed our show. As always, if you have information that you would like to share with us, or if you would like to come on our show, please contact us at COVID at gilmanwoolsey.com. We're always looking for new perspectives and to get an idea of what's going on out there. Thank you. Have a good night and be safe.